Hey, it's Dr. John with the Healthy MD and back with another COVID-19 video. This time actually going through and talking more about the science behind the Pfizer slash BioNTech and the Moderna mRNA vaccines, because it seems to be there's a lot of misinformation out there and people really that aren't getting vaccinated may not really have the best understanding of how these vaccines work. So what I'm going to do now is kind of dive in, look at the research behind it, show you why it's not, quote, experimental, and why this is actually probably the new wave of what vaccines are going to be doing. So let's talk about the mRNA vaccines and how they work. And they're really interesting as far as kind of the technology and science behind it. And it's not something that's, quote, new. It's actually there's been mRNA vaccine research for about the last 20 years, mostly in the cancer field, but have really advanced with the onset of COVID-19. So the basic science is that the vaccine delivers, quote, a recipe card, and that's what the mRNA particle is. mRNA is really messenger RNA that the body uses in all of our cells to make certain proteins. And what the vaccine actually does is delivers the mRNA for the spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and that's the virus that causes COVID-19. The spike protein is kind of the most recognizable part of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and by being able to replicate the spike protein in our cells, our immune system is then able to build up antibodies before we're actually infected with the SARS-CoV-2 and develop COVID-19. So again, it's kind of like an early warning system. We're putting out kind of a most wanted poster so people know what to look out for. And that's essentially how all vaccines work. But with the mRNA, it's a little bit of a different technology that we're using. And so really what happens is that in the lab, they produce this mRNA recipe card for the spike protein, and it's really then encapsulated or encircled in a pretty much like a piece of fat, droplet of fat, so a nanoparticle of lipid that allows the mRNA to easily get taken up by the cell. And once it enters the cell, there's a certain part of the cell that uses that mRNA to produce the spike protein, and the spike proteins then get pushed out to the cell wall, and antibodies or the lymphocytes can then recognize the spike protein as being a foreign product and develop the antibodies. So once the mRNA is taken up by the cells can start reading this recipe, the mRNA, the messenger mRNA, and start building the spike protein of the virus. And again, the mRNA only contains the recipe for the spike protein. It doesn't contain the whole SARS-CoV-2 virus. So it's a much safer method for vaccination than using a vaccine that contains a weakened version of the virus that we've used in the past. And these mRNA instructions for the spike protein are then read by a part of the cell called a ribosome, which then translates that mRNA recipe into a protein. And probably a good analogy may be to think of the ribosomes as being like a 3D printer. So you send the instructions to the 3D printer and it prints out this structure for you, and the ribosome is kind of the same way. It takes the mRNA and develops a protein depending on what the recipe of the mRNA tells it to do. And in this case, the vaccine is using the ribosome to print out a copy of the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein, and then that spike protein then makes it to the surface of the cell, where the lymphocytes in the body can then recognize it and develop antibodies to bind onto those spike proteins and tell the rest of the immune system, hey, here's something that's abnormal, here's a foreign intruder. And again, kind of gives your immune system the early warning system. So one of the other questions I get is what actually is in the mRNA vaccines, and I think that's one of the big concerns. People who are slow to get vaccinated or haven't gotten vaccinated yet keep saying, "Well, this is new. What's in it? And, is it going to harm me?" So it's actually pretty simple, and it's kind of a straightforward as far as ingredients. There's the messenger RNA, which again is just kind of the basic instructions, recipe card for the spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. There's also lipid droplets that they use, essentially fat. A couple of different types of salts like potassium chloride, sodium chloride, and a couple other salts that are used to stabilize it, and sucrose, which essentially is sugar. So really kind of not a lot of ingredients. And again, the most important part is that messenger RNA that needs to get into the cells, and the lipid droplet and the salts and the sugar or the sucrose are really just used to kind of stabilize it and allow the cell to take up the messenger RNA. And more importantly, what's not in the mRNA vaccines. And this is, I think, is also another big concern with some folks, and understandably so, because if you don't understand what's in it, and more importantly, what's not in it, then how can you make a good decision on it? So there's no proteins in these mRNA vaccines, and that's important for folks that have egg or gluten allergies. And we see this as an issue with folks that can't get the influenza vaccine because of egg allergies, because the influenza vaccine is actually grown or cultured in chicken eggs and then cultured down to be delivered as the flu shot. And so if you have an egg allergy, some people will actually have a pretty profound reaction to the influenza vaccine. That's not the case with these mRNA vaccines. There's no proteins in there. Other people worry about thimerosal, which was used as an adjunct in some previous vaccines. We don't have any of that in there. There's no blood products, and more importantly, no fetal cell lines are used to produce these mRNA vaccines. And I know that's been a concern with other older vaccines out there, that people, depending on what their religious beliefs are, don't want to use vaccines that were developed from fetal cell lines. But again, there's no fetal cell lines used to produce these mRNA vaccines, and most importantly, no microchips, and it wasn't designed by Bill Gates. So these are, again, pretty simple, straightforward vaccines, and again, kind of a much newer technology than what we've had in the past. And again, can't believe I actually have to talk about this, but hey, can mRNA vaccines change my DNA? And the short answer to that is no. But let's go into why that can't happen. So mRNA is actually very different from DNA as far as how it's designed and how it's structured. And in the human body, you can't actually translate or change or transcribe mRNA back into DNA. We just don't have the right enzyme to do that, or the right protein, and that's called reverse transcriptase. Now, there are viruses out there like HIV that actually use a reverse transcriptase. These are RNA viruses that use the reverse transcriptase to then take their own RNA and convert it to DNA, but it doesn't, again, bind into the cell. And also part of it is also location. So mRNA is actually active in the cytoplasm, which is kind of the outskirts of the cell, where the DNA is actually protected in our cell nucleus. So mRNA can't come into the cell nucleus. And so again, there's not an issue as far as it binding in or mutating and becoming part of your DNA. The other part with mRNA, it also has kind of a short shelf life. Most messenger RNA lasts for maybe a day or so, sometimes even less than that, several hours. So it's one of these things where it's almost like Snapchat, where you send out the post and only lasts for a certain amount of time, and then it's gone and you can't bring it on back. Messenger RNA is like that too, and there's actually kind of a self-destruct button, so to speak, that the cells have to degrade the mRNA and kind of chew it up and get rid of it once it's not needed anymore. Now these mRNA vaccines have kind of a stabilizer in there, so they stick around maybe for 3, 4, 5 days, because what you want to be able to do with this messenger RNA vaccine is continue to produce enough of these spike proteins where the body can recognize those spike proteins and develop the antibodies to it as well too. But they don't last long. The messenger RNA does not last long in the body. So let's talk a little bit about the mRNA vaccine research. What's out there? Was it actually done? Is it, quote, experimental? And there's, two big studies that were published back in December and February. So December of last year and February of this year, both on the Pfizer/BioNTech and the Moderna mRNA vaccine. So let's go through and just look at both of them real quick. So the first one was the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine study. This is the phase 3 study, and this is the one that, companies have to do if they're going to show that it's safe to use this in humans. And it's a pretty interesting study. And I'll actually start off, if you look at kind of all the authors in here, the second author here, Stephen J. Thomas, actually a med school classmate of mine. So we both went to medical school together, Albany Medical College in upstate New York. Both graduated, same class in 1996. Steve went on and served in the U.S. Army for over 20 years, both serving here stateside and overseas as an infectious disease doc. And that's important, I think, on a lot of ways, is that the U.S. Army's been really a leader in infectious disease research, throughout the years. And when you think about it, because they're deploying troops all over the world, those troops are at risk for a lot of different infectious diseases, where we're talking about malaria, yellow fever, typhoid, and then also potential exposure to bioweapons such as anthrax. And Steve did a lot of the research and headed up some of these programs in the U.S. Army that focused on not only dengue fever, but Zika and Ebola before coming in and working on COVID-19. And he's since retired. He's chief of infectious disease up at SUNY Upstate Medical Center in Syracuse, New York. But again, someone I've known for a long time, and it was really cool to kind of open this up and look at it and say, hey, I know that guy. So it kind of gives me a little bit of context as far as knowing someone who's actually in there. You're looking at the data and knowing him as a physician, and just having that comfort, knowing that people who are doing this really have the background in there. But let's look at how did this study turn out? And it was actually a pretty decent sized study. So they had over 43,000 people that they split up between the vaccine and the placebo. And the placebo is basically just salt water or saline that they gave to the volunteers. And people got 2 injections, 3 weeks apart, and they received the 30 nanogram dose if it was the vaccine versus the saline injection. And the thing about this is they do what they call double blind. So the people getting the injections, the volunteers in the study, they didn't know if they were getting the vaccine or if they're getting the placebo. The people giving the injections also did not know if they were giving the volunteers the placebo or the vaccine. And they went forward and kind of surveyed them as far as any type of side effects, and then who went on and developed COVID-19 and how severe their symptoms were. And so one of the endpoints they used was looking at COVID-19 infection 7 days after, or 7 days or more after the second dose, so 28 days after the first injection. And while they had 8 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in the vaccine group, they had 162 cases of confirmed COVID-19 in the placebo group. Quite a big difference. And as far as the severe cases of COVID-19, just 1 severe case in the vaccinated group with the Pfizer/BioNTech vaccine versus 9 severe cases in the placebo group. And so I think, again, that shows that it's a fairly well-designed, large study, 43,000 subjects, and this is worldwide too, so not just in the U.S. They did a really good job as far as matching the different people between the vaccine group and the placebo group, making sure that if they had comorbidities as far as being obese or hypertension, things like that, that they had the same number in both groups, so it wouldn't skew the results. They tested subjects from 16 years and up, and looked at the data from that standpoint as well too. So what about Moderna? That's the other mRNA vaccine that's out there. What's their research, at least their phase 3 studies? And they were a couple months later as far as getting their data out there. They published all their data in February of this year, also in the New England Journal of Medicine. And again, they kind of showed similar results. They had a little bit of a smaller study, 30,000 patients total, split between the vaccine group, the placebo group. Moderna, while it's still an mRNA vaccine, the dose was spread out over 4 weeks or 28 days in between the first and the second dose. And then again, they also their endpoints were measuring how many people developed symptomatic COVID-19. And out of the vaccine group, they only saw 11 people that developed COVID-19 out of that over 15,000. While in the placebo group, again, the people getting the saline or the saltwater injections and not the vaccine, there was 185 infections. And as far as severe cases of COVID-19, all severe cases of COVID-19 were in the placebo group, 30 cases, none in the vaccine group. And unfortunately, I actually even had 1 fatality in that placebo group as well too. So again, kind of showing the efficacy and how effective these 2 vaccines are. What's interesting is that Again, these were kind of a shorter time trial as far as length of time, but they're continuing on the studies as well too. So it's not that they just shut them down. It's okay, we did it, 2 months, 6 months, we're done. They're continuing to look at, are there any adverse side effects, long-term issues with this mRNA vaccines, and they're continuing to kind of study that and follow these, follow these test subjects, for 2 years, looking for these side effects. So I think overall, I'd have to say that these COVID-19 vaccines, at least mRNA ones, seem to be fairly safe and very effective. Now, you can debate whether or not, long-term, are we going to need booster shots? I'm actually going to talk about that in a different video because I think there's more detail we need to go into about, are booster shots needed? Who needs to get them? I think there's some, you can discuss both sides of this because I think there's also some counterpoints that are valid as far as, maybe you should hold off on booster shots for some of our folks too. Do the vaccines give better immunity than, just having a native COVID-19 infection? I think one of the issues I would say with that is, at least with the vaccines, we know specifically how much of a dose we're giving. For the Pfizer/BioNTech, it's a 30 nanogram dose that we're giving. For the Moderna vaccine, we're giving a 100 nanogram dose. And so we can really measure out what people's immunologic response is going to be. If you get kind of a COVID-19 infection, quote, in the wild, out in public, we don't know how your body specifically is going to react to that because everyone's viral load is going to be different on how they respond, and we just don't know, how long your immunity is going to last. And there are people who are having, second COVID infections that have had COVID infections 6, 8, 9 months ago. And granted, there's also folks who have had the vaccine. They're getting COVID infections after the vaccine. But at least what I'm seeing personally is that those folks that have been vaccinated have much, much milder cases of COVID-19. And again, that's kind of, I think, the take home with this is these vaccines actually really, really decrease the risk of you developing severe COVID-19, of ending up in the hospital, of ending up in the intensive care unit, of ending up intubated, and more importantly, ending up dying from COVID-19. These, at least the mRNA vaccines are really shown to be really efficacious for that. So again, that's all I have right now for talking about the mRNA vaccine. So hopefully this was helpful as far as understanding how they work, kind of their safety profile, and at least the phase 3 studies behind them. So be back with some more info on this, unfortunately, because it seems that we're still going to be in the thick of a COVID-19 pandemic for a little bit longer. So be talking about booster shots, things you can also do to keep yourself healthy from preventing COVID-19, and any other debates or issues that come up till then. So again, I'm Dr. John Martinez with Healthy MD. If you like this video, please hit the subscribe button and hit the like button. That's how we show up on the search engines, and that's how YouTube shows us other folks, so would appreciate that. And we'll talk to you soon.